What if I told you that in the samurai courts of feudal Japan, same-sex love wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated? Behind sliding paper doors and beneath the cherry blossoms, warriors pledged not only loyalty, but affection and passion to one another. These bonds between men were written into poetry, immortalized in art, and whispered about in tea houses. They weren't scandals. They were traditions that could shape alliances, shift power, and decide the fate of entire clans. We're about to uncover a hidden history where romance between men was woven into the very fabric of honor and duty, a world that defies the modern narrative. Before we begin comment, the time you're watching this, I love seeing our global history family connect. And if you want more stories that reveal the truth behind the myths, consider subscribing. No pressure, but this is just the beginning. You step into a corridor of cedar and paper, the night air carrying green tea and lamp oil, and you find yourself walking behind a samurai whose armor cords whisper like grass and wind, while a page, still in the hairstyle of a wakashu with the forelock left unshaved, matches his stride with the precision of a shadow. You notice how everyone knows where to look and where not to look, how courtesy turns into choreography, and how the distance between a seasoned warrior and his apprentice is measured not just in paces, but in vows recited over ink and steel, which you read on their faces more than on any scroll. You learn the words first because names make fog into paths. Nanshoku for male love, Shudo for the way of youths, Ninja for the elder partner, Wakashu for the younger, whose liminal status shows in clothing, details, and hair, reminding you of how a modern uniform can tell you rank before a single syllable is spoken. No one says it loudly, yet inscriptions in diaries and letters survive, and you hear them in your head like a temple bell at dusk as you stand in a courtyard where wooden practice swords thud and pride tries not to smile. You pause by armor, stands, and realize training is only half of what binds them. The other half is a lattice of etiquette so tight it could hold a roof exchange of gifts. Short poems, a lacquered netsuke, maybe a tanto, with a plain scabbard to avoid gossip, plus conditions that sound like a code of honor. Fidelity promised while the youth still wears the forelock. Correction, not cruelty support in battle, not just in the poetry alcove. You think of modern mentor programs and quietly admit none of them require taking an arrow for your supervisor, which puts these vows into a brisker perspective than any handbook. You follow the pair to the garden, noticing the apprentice recites a verse about the moon, touching the spear tip, a polite way to say, I see you, while the warrior answers with an image of spring rain on old armor, a polite way to say, I see you back. You recall that later in 1687, Ihara Saikaku would fill a whole great mirror of male love with tales like this. But the seeds are already here in the Muromachi and Sengoku eras, where the battlefield supplies the stress test and rumor supplies the rest. A crane erupts from the reeds, and you catch the smallest ripple of pride ripple through the older man's shoulders, as if a crest has just flashed. You pass a screen painting of pine and rock, and hear a name that makes historians perk up, Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who reshaped the map associated in chronicles and later anecdotes with his close page, Moriran Maru, famed for loyalty that did not need a witness to be believed. You make a mental note that sources differ in tone, yet converge on devotion. And in a world where a lord's life could depend on who tightened his armor cords, in the pre-dawn devotion is not a soft word at all. which you grasp while counting the heartbeat between the older man's order and the youth's silent bow. You cross the veranda and find another dossier waiting like a folded letter. Takeda Shingen and his trusted commander, Kosaka Masanobu, whose preserved correspondence includes lines of affection and duty so intertwined you could not untangle them without breaking the thread. You read one line aloud under your breath and realize the vocabulary of favor, benevolence, and unwavering heart is doing heavy lifting. The way corporate emails today say, appreciate when they mean, this matters to me, and you accept that euphemism can be a more durable scaffold than shouty declarations when reputations are built from silence as much as steel. You drift into the armory, where lacquer gleams like nighttime water, and a senior retainer explains the boundary everyone is supposed to understand. Respect hinges on the wakashu's status as not yet man with hair and clothing, marking the threshold that will inevitably close. When the forelock is shaved and adulthood arrives, the relationship must transform or end so that hierarchy and decorum remain intact, which sounds like a calendar alarm for the heart, but functioned as social ballast. To make it real, he lists penalties for coercion, cheating, or boasting, because disgrace spreads faster than smoke through a wooden town. And you see how an honor code both shields and shapes desire without saying the quiet parts on paper. You sit for tea with a low-ranking archer who speaks of small mercies, an older companion who corrected his footwork, who shared a lucky charm before a skirmish, who taught him how to knot his sash so it would not slip at the worst moment. He doesn't dramatize, he inventories, which makes you trust him. And when he mentions that a poem exchanged before campaign season felt heavier than a new quiver, you think of how modern people screenshot certain messages like talismans, proof that someone saw them clearly for a minute that outlived the minute you wander past the men's quarters as laughter lifts and stops, like birds startled from a branch. And a steward reminds you of the practical logic. People often miss a society of warriors spends long seasons in homosocial settings where proximity risk and patronage mingle so bonds that blend training. Loyalty and affection are not exotic, but inevitable. He adds a conservative aside about family lines still requiring marriage, and airs a reminder that these bonds coexist with duty to clan. And you catch how contradiction is not a bug in this system, but the tension that holds the bowstring, which you feel in the hush that returns when the steward's sandals fade down the hall. You end the night by the practice yard, where fireflies flirt with the eaves, and the older warrior corrects the youth's stance with the softest tap of the scabbard, less touch than punctuation. And you realize the whole scene is a grammar of gestures that has been written and rewritten across centuries. The terms shudo and nanshoku, the visible marker of the forelock, the rules about gifts and discretion, the recorded pairings that leave paper trails just long enough to follow. You listen for bravado and hear craftsmanship instead, like a blade polished so long it reflects the lantern without showing the hand that holds it. So you keep the lantern light in your eyes and follow the bell across the valley to the cloister, where floorboards answer your steps with a hush, and incense hangs like a soft curtain you walk through again and again. The temple is a machine for measuring breath, tatami grids, water ladles, the timing of the watchman's clappers, and you notice how desire is expected to dissolve into discipline here, at least on paper, because celibacy sits in the rule book like a boundary stone that rain cannot move, even if moss tries. You learn the vocabulary of order first, because monasteries turn words into walls. The precepts, the shingi or temple codes, the schedule that slots dawn, zazen work sutras, and sleep like beads on a string. Dogen's Eihai Shingi prescribes where you put your bowl and how you fold your blanket, and you register the intention. Reduce improvisation, reduce trouble, like an IT policy that limits admin privileges so no one can download feelings they shouldn't. The ideal is clear mind, like a still pond body, like a wooden post, attachments let go before they sprout branches that shade the hall. You pass under a lintel painted with clouds and find the human peace that rules never fully contain the presence of attendants, pages attached to senior clerics, novices not yet fully ordained youths, serving in pageants and rituals, whose beauty is praised in poetry and depicted in paintings, known later as Chigoi silk scrolls, where a young attendant wears layered brocade and a wistful look that art historians argue about with the stamina of marathoners. You keep your focus on how aesthetics function as symbols of purity, festival, and liminality rather than a shopping list of private meanings, because the only responsible way to read old images is to admit what we know, what we suspect, and what we choose not to sensationalize. You sit beneath a cypress and listen to the way Gozan monks in Kyoto and Kamakura talk about refinement, ink tea, regulated calm, while life leaks in through side doors. A senior monk explains the device everyone understands, without anyone saying it out loud. Constant supervision, shared dormitories, fixed lights out, and a rotating seating chart that would make a modern teacher proud. The premise is simple. The mind is calmer when the schedule leaves no loose ends, and the heart behaves better when no one is ever truly alone with their whispers. After curfew, which you interpret as both compassionate and practical, in a building where paper walls make secrets travel faster than smoke. You step into the library and finger a copy of Muju Ichien's Shasekishu, a collection of sand and pebbles, those brief moral tales from the late Kamakura period where monks and layfolk blunder into lessons like travelers who mistake a mirage for a harbor. The anecdotes do not offer blueprints. They offer warnings, winks, and the quiet suggestion that rules exist because appetites exist, which is exactly what any HR department could tell you if it were allowed to write parables. You turn a leaf and recognize the subtext. Spiritual lineage asks for care, and care means boundaries, because beauty without boundaries becomes gossip that eats time meant for practice. You look up, and the shelves have already slipped you forward to Yoshida Kenko, the recluse who writes Surezurigusa, essays in idleness, with the shrugging honesty of someone who has watched enough seasons to stop pretending people are tidy. He admires the fleeting notes, how affections flare and fade, and you take from him a method. Pay attention, don't be shocked by the obvious, and measure customs by the balance they claim to produce. When he observes that people admire what is just beyond their reach, you hear an X-ray of monastic longing that doesn't need a microscope to be true. You find a portrait of Ikkyu Sojun, the 15th century iconoclast, his eyes like a clever storm, and you remember that he wrote frankly about desire as a way to scold hypocrisy rather than to sell scandal. His poems crackle as if he is tapping the wooden fish with a grin, and you take the hint, spiritual practice, notice his cravings, not to indulge them, but to avoid pretending they never knock. If you've ever tried not to think about a pink elephant and then filled your head with a herd, you understand why monks talk about guarding the gate of the eyes while still living in a world full of festivals, brocade, and faces. People praise in polite verse. You lean over a covered walkway and watch a procession rehearsal for a temple festival. Attendants in brilliant robes, riding small horses' banners, moving like river grass. The pageants are public. The meanings are layered. The care is choreographed so well you could mistake it for serenity itself. A senior clerk points out the practical rules that sit behind the spectacle lodging's assigned mentors responsible for conduct curfew, enforced complaints, recorded like temple accounts. You notice how administrative rigor turns empathy into architecture, which is not romantic, but it keeps a lot of people safe in wooden buildings with 1,000 corners. You hear, as pilgrims always do, the folk story that credits Kukai with importing a culture of male love from China, and you file it where historians file it as a later rumor that says more about the storytellers than about the 9th century founder himself. Myths proliferate around charismatic names because rumor loves gravity wells, and you adopt a historian's pose, smile, note the source, ask what the claim accomplishes. In this case, it absolves the present by exporting responsibility to the past, which is a neat trick, and also a reminder to separate verifiable practice from legend when the lantern light makes all centuries look equally nearby. You pass a low hall where calligraphy dries and a gentle-voiced preceptor describes duty between senior and junior instruction in reading chanting etiquette. Guidance that is accountable to the community, kindness that is witnessed, not hidden. He taps the posted code with 2 fingers and says, what every institution says when it means to keep people whole. No coercion, no private meetings outside, permitted times, leadership subject to review. And you clock the continuity with modern safeguarding policies that try, however imperfectly, to keep mentorship from turning into leverage. If you've ever filled out a consent form and thought it bureaucratic, you now see the centuries-old ancestor of that paperwork sitting quietly on a wooden pillar. You breathe in the incense again and notice how the temple's response to beauty is sublimated into art poems, admired in daylight portraits, painted for festivals, metaphors that give admiration an off-ramp into culture rather than secrecy. The logic is not perfect. Few logics are. But you sense why so many records from cloisters read like weather reports, short, factual, unadorned, because when reputation equals livelihood, understatement becomes a survival skill, as essential as sweeping leaves before the abbot walks by. You glance toward the gate as a bell marks the hour, and a file of pilgrims enters heads, dipped sandals, dusted white from the road. The monks greet them with bowls of tea the novices pour, and for a moment the whole system looks exactly as designed, service study repetition, while the human heart moves under the robe like a bird. You hear, but cannot see, which you recognize as the sound that makes poets reach for their brush in rooms where even conversation is supposed to fold itself into silence. You slip down lantern-lit streets where willow branches comb the air, and the canal shows you 2 cities at once. The wooden one you walk, and the upside-down one that trembles in water, until the gate of the licensed quarter swallows you with its warm, buzzing mouth. People call this world Ukiyo, the floating world, because everything here is composed like foam music that fades perfume, that thins faces, that melt back into night, and yet you notice how carefully the stage is built to make evanescence feel curated rather than chaotic, as if someone invented gravity just so fans could practice falling for performers and getting up politely afterward. You hear drums from a theater first, the Ichimura-za or Nakamura-za, and drift in with the crowd where the stage juts out like a ship's prow, and the Hanamichi. The flower path cuts through the seats so actors can walk through adoration as if crossing a shallow river. Women were banned from kabuki decades ago. Then boys were banned, so adult men hold every role now. Yet your eyes can't easily file them under male or female once the powder and the wigs go on. The onagata glide with white oshiroi dust, red lines at the eyes, like music notation, and gestures slow enough to let the audience read meaning as if it were subtitles in the air, which you learn to do within minutes because the hall teaches you how to see. You watch an onagata in a cherry-patterned kimono arrange a sleeve with a precision that a swordmaster might envy, and you remember Yoshizawa Ayame, the legend who wrote that an onagata should live as a woman offstage to perfect grace on stage. You can debate the rule. You cannot debate its effect when the audience leans forward in a single motion, like wheat meeting a breeze. A vendor slips past selling actor prints Yakusha-e with the flourish of a modern merch table, and you recognize faces by name the way people today recognize athletes. Ichikawa Danjuro for rough style thunder, Segawa Kikunojo for dreamlike poise, and Shiraku's sharper-than-truth portraits that make stage emotions look like earthquakes caught in paper. You step outside at intermission, and the theater district doubles as a fan convention. Shop windows hawk printed poems, hairpins modeled after a star's stage ornament, and tiny votive plaques you can hang in your room to ask invisible forces to nudge your favorite actor toward triumph. You catch a gossip wave about who sits in which box tonight and what gift arrived backstage, and realize the economy of attention here is mapped like a city alleyways of rumor feeding into boulevards of reputation. If you've ever seen a queue for a limited edition drop, you know the choreography hush tips, the late night dash, the thrill of owning a sliver of someone whose face you'll never forget. You follow lanterns toward tea houses where companionship is performed as art. And the word companion does a lot of careful work in a town that prefers euphemism to blunt edges. Inside attendants play shamisen, pour sake trade, verses and supply the theater's afterglow with soft focus and practiced conversation. Some houses keep young male entertainers kagema, whose hair still bears the telltale forelock that marks the threshold of youth you learned back in the barracks yard, and you see how a calendar can be a social contract when style codes draw lines that everyone can read from across a room. The staff move with stage-like polish, which you realize is the whole point. Even the spontaneous has rehearsal baked into it. You pick up a guidebook from a stand, one of those thick, witty directories to the quarter that reviewers update like connoisseurs of tea, and chuckle at how it reads like a cross between a restaurant list and a theater almanac. It names streets, rates establishments, notes which houses specialize in witty banter, and which shine in arranging poetry contests that blur into dawn. You note, as historians do, that such guides confirm the public face of a system the authorities tolerate and supervise rather than pretend doesn't exist. Because order loves a fence, it can inspect at dusk and dawn. And this quarter is very much a fence with music on both sides. You notice how the aesthetic of youth is its own language, sleeves a bit longer, colors a touch brighter. A fan opened with a playful snap rather than a quiet sigh. That language can be read by women and men alike. And today's audience swirls with both, each armed with a favorite actor's profile, tucked into a sleeve like a saint's image. A publisher points at a fresh stack of prints by Utagawa Toyokuni, and Kunisada faces carved and inked with celebrity glow, and asks which you'll take home. Quick poll. Would you hang the fierce glare of a Danjuro hero above your sleep mat, or the soft tilted gaze of a Kikunojo heroine whose silence seems louder than applause? You duck into a small shop that sells stage accessories and overhear a costumer explaining rules the police sometimes enforce with scissors, hair regulations, sleeve lengths, the line between permitted illusion and forbidden provocation. The story is familiar if you've ever watched a platform adjust its community guidelines in real time. Performers test edges, authorities redraw them, and style evolves by dodging chalk marks with a smile that never quite admits it is running. The result is an art of suggestion that keeps audiences awake with implication rather than noise, and you catch yourself admiring how much can be said with a glance that lingers for exactly one heartbeat and no more. You step back under the main gate and watch couples, patrons, and groups of friends drift between theaters and tea houses like schools of fish, changing direction without collisions. Somewhere, a print seller calls out a new Shiraku face. Somewhere, a guide finishes a whispered tour with a bow. Somewhere, a discreet door closes on a private room where conversation will stretch like silk past midnight. Printed poems circulate as souvenirs of evenings that will be remembered more for how the lantern light gilded a cheekbone than for anything anyone can quote later, which is the floating world's favorite magic trick, leaving you sure you felt something while leaving almost nothing you can pin to the wall. You pause at the canal where a boatman hums, and the moon pretends to be a lantern hung by a patient god. The actors resume across the water. The Hanamichi glows, and in the ripple, you can see why critics call this era a laboratory for performance of gender, a place where beauty becomes a public service crafted by training costume and the slow grammar of gesture. You catalog the pieces. On Nagata discipline, actor print, celebrity supervised quarters, coded youth styles, guidebooks that wink while they warn, and feel how the city spins them into routine, the way a tea whisk spins froth, leaving a taste both sweet and faintly bitter on the tongue, that does not ask for an explanation before the drum calls you back to the street. You follow the last drum beat out of the quarter into quieter streets, where armor creaks again, and paper doors exhale, and you notice the floating world runs on theater, while the warrior world runs on rules, which you begin hearing the way a musician hears time signatures, even when no one is counting aloud. Etiquette introduces itself first through small objects, because objects remember what mouths should not say. A fan with ribs of bamboo slides into a sleeve and shuts with the soft click of authority. An incense pouch sewn from brocade carries a private blend whose clove-warm note will later serve as a calling card. A short poem brushed onto a tanzaku strip dries by the brazier until the ink shines like fish scales. A sash knot is drilled until it will not betray you at a sprint. A kozuka knife bears a tiny motif, a grass stem, a moon sliver chosen for a joke only two people can catch from across a courtyard. When you ask what counts as proper, the reply arrives, like a checklist someone keeps in memory, rather than on paper. Exclusivity holds during the youth's forelock years, marked as clearly as a painted lintel. Admonishment is allowed, because training without correction is vanity, but cruelty is forbidden. Because discipline that bruises reputation bruises the house. Bragging is treated as a stain that polishing cannot remove, so praise travels by other mouths or not at all. Protection is expected in the field and in council, and tokens are returned if the spirit of the vow has been breached. Because a gift is not a trinket when it launders trust in public view. You step into a small tea room, are handed a brush, and learn the choreography of a promise that prefers poetry to fireworks. The elder writes a 31-syllable verse that hides names inside images moon on spear-tipped dew, on armor, lace sleeves wet with dawn. And the younger answers in kind, sliding the reply into the elder's sleeve. So it feels discovered rather than delivered, which makes the moment idle past the guards, like a citizen with perfect papers. Before campaign season, the two of you prepare the practicals that only look romantic to people who have never ridden in rain. A talisman from a shrine is folded and tucked into a breastplate pocket like a second heart. A small mirror is wrapped in paper as a token to steady the mind when fog pushes the horizon 3 steps away. A pouch of flint and steel is exchanged with a joke about who will forget theirs first. A death poem outline is sketched because warriors pack for bad weather, even on clear mornings, the way travelers keep an umbrella near the door without announcing anything to the sky. You watch a coming-of-age ceremony and feel an invisible hinge click. The forelock goes. The hairstyle becomes an adult top knot. The garments take on a soberer dye. The swords lengthen and suddenly sit with the weight of responsibility rather than costume. With that, the etiquette shifts. What was an asymmetry of training and youth becomes a partnership expected to resemble comradeship more than patronage. And if it does not shift, everyone can tell by the fan width of air left between two kneeling figures. A steward, who is really the office manager of the Sengoku, outlines enforcement with a dryness that feels almost modern. If someone boasts a superior, may reassign him to distant duty where his audience becomes winter crows. If someone coerces, penalties range from formal censure to dismissal because power that forgets consent corrodes rank. If a token is flaunted, the Lord may require its return in front of witnesses, not to humiliate affection, but to humiliate arrogance, which is how corridors stay passable when tempers run as hot as lacquer in August. You leaf again through Saikaku's tales and notice how often the happiest episodes are less about secrecy than about competence. Two people exchanging signals without disrupting the room. A timely rescue on a skirmish line. A verse composed under pressure that lands like cool water. And you catch the moral that sits under the stories like floor joists. The more artful the etiquette, the less space scandal has to work with the way good joinery leaves no crack for a draft to whistle through, which keeps reputations from swaying like shutters in a storm. On certain nights, the vow takes the shape of shared names, a custom of bestowing a character from a senior's name to a junior as recognition. Identity is not being confused. Lineage is being braided, and script is the cord. The calligrapher who inks the new character onto a name card understands he is drawing a thread. Other eyes will read decades later when the paper has browned at the edges, which is how language does the slow work of memory while people are busy polishing fittings. You examine weapon fittings and find feeling hidden in metalwork. A tsuba carries a single autumn grass that both of you know refers to an evening in the practice yard when wind wrote kanji no teacher could grade. A manuki pear shaped like cranes nests under each of your palms, a private migration held by silk. A sageo cord is dyed to a particular indigo that looks ordinary until moonlight catches it on a march, which is how craft lets the heart pass checkpoints without presenting a passport. A junior archer shows you the etiquette of distance, which feels like a paradox until you watch it for a morning. In the hall, you do not sit too close. On the road, you do not lag too far. In formal audience, your eyes stay where protocol says they should. And yet 100 small timings: who pours tea first, who finishes a verse, who checks a strap without comment, stayed out loud. What tongues keep discipline, which lets bystanders understand enough to admire without being fed enough to meddle. When separation approaches, the rules do not soften so much as they grow more ceremonial. The elder wraps a packet of herbs to scent a travel chest. The younger prepares a ledger of small debts to settle at return ink candles, a cracked practice sword because bonds that never mention the bill do not survive campaign season. A tiny guardian charm is tied to a saddle strap where only one pair of eyes will see it. An address to a shrine is memorized, so letters can be left for collection without running afoul of gossip patrols. Out on a training field before dawn, you watch a drill, pause for one extra heartbeat that no official will admit exists. A line reforms, a correction lands with 2 fingers to the elbow. A nod is returned without a smile, and the file moves on with no disturbance except the faint breath of clove from a pouch that shifted, which makes you concede the entire system is shared. Stagecraft, whose aim is not to hide feeling, but to fit it so well inside conduct that it travels with the grain of the floor. You glance back at the tea room and realize the etiquette has an emergency brake only seasoned pairs know how to pull. If command changes or households merge, if politics knocks over chairs, the exchange of tokens pauses. The poem stopped naming anything traceable, and the relationship is translated into ordinary comradeship that everyone can read, which is less tragic than it sounds when you remember that survival is also a form of devotion. In a century that replaces maps as quickly as roofs, at a roadside shrine, the younger sets a thin slip of wood with a vow written down the grain and bows twice while the elder straightens a travel cloak and pretends to study the carp in the basin. And you notice the bell you heard earlier has followed you into field etiquette ringing, not to forbid feeling, but to time it the way a metronome keeps music from sprinting in the first bar and stumbling in the last. You enter a castle that breathes like a sleeping beast. Moats like dark eyelids, arrow slits blinking to measure wind. And you realize politics here moves best when it whispers, not when it clanks. Corridors braid toward the Lord's private suite. The night guard pads on split-toe socks, and the little bell by the bed isn't only for emergencies. It times conversations that begin after ceremonies end, and before roosters can tattle, which you clock as the hour when loyalty tests stop sounding like speeches and start sounding like weather forecasts murmured into a sleeve. You've met the vocabulary already: wakashu, ninja, shudo. But now add the job titles that grease Hinge's page of attendance: Kosho, Horse Guard Officer, Umamawari, and Chamberlain tasked with filtering visitors so a lord only sees what keeps him legendary. Access is currency, and whoever pours tea after curfew quietly owns a sliver of policy. The way whoever manages a CEO's calendar today quietly decides which dreams get daylight. Stipends measured in koku of rice change hands because a sentence spoken in a quiet room 2 nights ago made a plan look inevitable. And either you learned this too late, or you were pouring the tea when inevitability was born. You sit on the tatami, just outside the screens, during a night council that prefers the word cushion to chair, and the word favor to anything riskier. The war map looks like a game board until someone touches a fortress symbol with two fingers and a courier is already halfway to the stables. The Lord asks for an opinion that sounds small, but lands like a stone in a basin. The favored retainer replies in that tuned-down register you recognize from actors who know the microphone is close. If you've ever watched a group chat bloom into action because one person typed a single careful line, you know the shape of power these rooms practice without applauding themselves for it. You catch the household's rumor routes like a cartographer sketching rivers. The stables produce facts. First, the kitchens produce jokes. Second, and the women's quarters, another galaxy with its own gravity supply. High-quality meteorology about everyone's moods. The pages ferry messages between these climates with the grace of birds, changing altitude, and envy follows them like a shadow that needs no lantern. A senior steward, keen as a hawk, tracks who lingers too long by which door, and files the lingerings in a mind where color-coded tabs would be proud to live if color-coded tabs had been invented. You observe how gifts make politics tactile. A lacquered writing set arrives at dusk with a card that is only a poem about maple leaves if you pretend not to hear the line about mountains parting after frost. A short blade with ordinary fittings arrives at morning call, the ordinariness itself, a statement that the sender understands how to reduce glare, which is another way to say I am safe to stand beside when trumpets blow. A scarf, scented with the clove blend you smelled in the barracks, moves through 3 hands before reaching a sleeve, and somewhere a rival marks the exchange in a ledger the world will never see, because the world is made of ledgers that do not announce themselves at the gate. You overhear a cautionary tale that the castle tells itself to stay balanced. A young favorite brags a rival feeds the brag to a clerk, and the clerk plants it where it will grow in the Lord's ear, like a weed politely shaped into a topiary. Reassignment follows new province, less noise. The sudden discovery that winter can last all year if the wind blows from headquarters and everyone learns the lesson again, which is that intimacy that forgets usefulness turns from asset to audit item faster than a hawk can fold its wings. Question for the night owls. Have you ever watched someone confuse proximity with permanence and wished them a kinder teacher than this profession is capable of being? You wander into a records room and read the rice like other people read novels. Grants loans, bonuses for distinguished archery, quiet reductions for inconvenient cousins. The handwriting tightens when the decision was hard and relaxes when the argument had momentum. 2 rooms earlier at a low table where only 3 cups were poured. Political historians will later call this patronage. You sitting with the smell of ink in your nose call it gravity, the kind that makes small moons orbit bright bodies, until one day a new mass enters the room and the moons shuffle without complaint. Because survival in this cosmos depends on keeping your tides obedient. You pause under a screen painting of cranes and think of familiar pairs whose names keep surfacing like good steel catching light. Oda Nobunaga and Ranmaru Shingen and Kosaka, figures everyone cites not to sell scandal, but to point at a template where fierce competence and private trust traveled in the same palanquin. Chronicles written by men who admired understatement. Choose verbs like attended, served closely kept vigil, and those verbs carry more voltage than they admit. You read them the way a stagehand reads a lighting cue. Not flashy, absolutely decisive, and always in the same place in the script. If the production intends to end with the right banner hanging above the right gate, you take the stairs that tilt toward Edo time and note how the mechanics change under Tokugawa peace without changing their bones. The alternate attendance system Sankin Kotai drags lords to the shogun's capital every other year. Like the tide, and whole mansions unfurl along moats to house retinues that could populate a small city. Pages become scheduling software in human form. Chamberlains become firewalls. Access to an afternoon stroll with a senior figure becomes a futures contract written in the weather. The laws for the military houses. Buke Shohato Preach Order and the Okyu. The inner apartments make that order plausible by deciding who crosses which threshold when the day turns sideways and decisions need to look inevitable again. You stand outside a sliding door and hear the clink of 2 cups, the soft scrape of a map, and a sentence so carefully built it could be a lacquer box. If this road is reinforced by the 6th month, the 7th will not test our patience. The speaker is not loud. The decision is, a retainer brings in a burner, so the Lord can warm his hands while he warms to the plan, and you notice how comfort serves strategy without ever being accused of it. When the 2 rise, the retinue outside has already adjusted tomorrow's appointments by a finger width, which is how empires tilt by degrees that on paper look like weather, but in practice look like someone remembered to stand in the right doorway at the right hour. You end up beside the veranda that faces the moon viewing platform where favored retainers sometimes wait. The way stagehands wait for a cue, silent and ready to move, a piece of furniture the audience will never see moved. The floor catches just enough night chill to remind feet they are mortal. The garden sips the wind as if rehearsing for autumn, and down the corridor, a notary finishes copying a letter that will send grain to one province and patience to another. None of this announces itself as passion. All of it smells faintly of clove and fresh ink, which is politics' favorite perfume when it means to travel far without being stopped for questions. It has no intention of answering before sunrise. You wake to the sound of a brush rinsed in a basin and realize affection in this country prefers to leave a trail. You can touch ink stains carved wood, a thread dyed to a secret shade, so that memory doesn't have to argue with rumor when the season changes and the clove in a sleeve turns faint. You sit beside a low table while a tanzaku strip, narrow and pale like a sliver of moon, waits for the first stroke, and the elder partner grinds sumi until the ink's surface turns glossy, the way a pond turns serious before rain. 31 syllables arrive as if stepping stones appear underfoot tanka, not the swaggering drums of an epic, but the steady breath count you already heard in the barracks poems about dew on armor lace. Keke kotoba, the pivot words, do their mirror trick, so pine becomes to wait, and sleeve becomes tear. And you sign the verse with a personal seal, pressed into cinnabar paste. Hanko, which lands like a heartbeat you can stack in a box with last spring's heartbeat without needing to say anything out loud. You learn that letters travel best when they look like small gifts. Koibumi love notes, fold in Tato styles, that would make an origami teacher nod the paper wrapped with a mizuhiki cord tied in a waji musubi, so the knot promises to tighten rather than loosen with a tug. The delivery is a choreography of plausible errands. A retainer hands an inro, a small tiered medicine case, across a threshold, and only 2 people know. The top compartment holds nothing medicinal at all, except a line about fireflies hovering over a practice yard. If you've ever slid a message to yourself into a phone wallpaper as a private nudge, you understand why the inro becomes a traveling locker for sentences that would blush under lanterns. You handle the toggles that keep the inro riding a sash without falling. Netsuki carved as crane's carp persimmons a coiled dragon the size of a thumb, and see how craftspeople hide jokes and vows inside grain. One netsuke is a pair of ginkgo leaves, each leaf's veins meeting in a way only two people would read, as the night by the canal, when an actor's sleeve brushed a wrist. Another is a moon rabbit pounding medicine, a sweet pun that tells the recipient to keep steady during the next campaign. You finger the polish that comes from years of handling and realize that durability is the argument. These objects make the same argument a sword fitting makes when it chooses understatement over flash, so it can be worn every day without inviting questions from the wrong mouths. You follow a whispered introduction into a back room where a horishi tattoo master sets out rods and pigments the way a tea master sets out cups, each tool with a name, each cup. For a moment, no one should rush. The technique is tebori, hand-driven, the skin lifted by rhythm rather than machine, and the designs unfurl from shoulder to hip like a curtain you won't show the street, because the street is policed by sumptuary rules that scold bright fabrics and scold even louder when a canvas walks under its own power. Edo's firefighters, the haiku favor, broad panels of waves and peonies that turn bathhouses into galleries, and laborers wear muscled koi pushing upstream because stubbornness ranks as a civic virtue when timber cities flirt with sparks. You watch the needle tap and think of how Utagawa Kuniyoshi's prints of the Suikoden outlaws feed patterns to the skin, the way an actor print feeds poses to a stage images moving from paper to people with the friction of admiration rather than decree. You hear the other story too, because the city keeps its ledgers straight. Some domains brand criminals with punitive tattoos, simple marks on forearms or faces that announce misdeed to gatekeepers who read skin as easily as travel papers. The decorative horomono you see here defy that script by turning ink into pride rather than stigma, a quiet inversion that makes law chase fashion down alleys it didn't design. Comparison check. For the moderns, think of how a once mandatory uniform badge becomes a self-chosen patch on a jacket after the rules lose their whistle, and you have the silhouette of this reversal without needing to peek at anything the guidelines would prefer we didn't describe. You meet a pair who choose matching motifs that hide in plain sight. He takes a half peony on the right shoulder. She, or the onagata who lives femininity with a dedication Yoshizawa Ayami prescribed, takes the mirror half on the left, and the two flowers only bloom whole when a bathhouse steam or a riverbank wind lines them up by accident. Could a pair of cranes read too obvious, a pair of fans too clever, a sliver of moon too sentimental? The horishi smiles and says, the right emblem is the one you can explain to a stranger without lying, while reserving the real explanation for the person who already knows it. You return to paper and understand why some couples prefer ink they can shelve. A Tanzaku Beiko box for poem slips collects a year's worth of verses like tiles for a roof you can hold in your hands. The handwriting evolves in visible steps. The youth's characters stiff with care in spring, relaxed by summer. A little storm tossed by autumn letters written from the road during Sanken Kotai. The alternate attendance that yanks lords and retainers toward Edo with tide force. A Senryu, witty cousin of haiku, sneaks in to relieve seriousness with a sideways grin, because even vows need comic timing to survive bureaucracy without becoming stone. You sit through a game of incense kodo, where guests try to identify blends by breath alone, and you realize scent is the stealthiest ink. A pair devises a signature mix, clove a cedar note, a hint of aloes wood stolen from a wedding chest, and after that you can locate them in a corridor without seeing them. The way earlier, you knew a council had finished when two cups clinked behind a screen. Genjiko pattern cards score the guesses, but the real score is that a smell becomes a door you can open in memory when paper is too fragile and tattoos are too public for the next appointment. You place a tiny relic into a kinchaku pouch, a sliver of silk trimmed from a sleeve lining, not dramatic enough to earn gossip, but enough to anchor a day, and the elder ties the drawstring with a looped knot that sailors and samurai share. Locks of hair exist, yes, but a fragment of cloth avoids the solemnity of shears and the rumors they like to drag around. So taste chooses a quieter thread that can pass a gate without catching a guard's eye. On the pouch's mouth, a thin wooden tag bears a brushed character, not a full name, just the stroke that your hand knows how to finish when no one is watching. You leaf actor prints again, because the floating world leaves souvenirs, like a theater leaves glitter in your collar. A shiraku face taped to the inside of a travel chest. A kunisada pair, framed and hung where the first sunbeam nails it. Each morning, a private collection kept in the back of a shop that also sells writing paper, because the shopkeeper understands that love of surfaces feeds love of sentences and back again. Do you keep a photo in your wallet, even though your phone holds 1,000? Same energy, different ink. You stand in a bathhouse doorway at dusk and catch the brief parliament of images, waves, tigers, maple leaves, chrysanthemums speaking in low steam to peonies and dragons, while laughter lifts like sparrows. Outside, no one shouts meanings. Inside, no one needs to. The rules about forelocks and top knots still count. The etiquette of poems and tokens still keeps corridors breathable. But here ink votes for endurance, paper votes for tenderness, and carved toggles vote for the kind of secrecy that wears a grin rather than a mask, while the water pretends not to overhear anyone's plans for next season. You take your seat again where the hanamichi slices the crowd like a bright canal, and the air tastes faintly of roasted chestnuts and stage powder, while a hush thickens into the sort of silence that amplifies every rustle of silk without needing to ask anyone to be quiet. The drum taps the shamisen thread, begins, and an onnagata enters with a step so small you almost miss the distance-covered suriashi, the sliding walk that erases footfall, and the wrist tilts a fan in a half-moon that reads like a sigh written with lacquer, which your eyes decode before your mind catches up, because kabuki trains you to read movement as grammar, long before the script sends you a sentence. You study the face work, oshiroi white that softens jawlines, faint vermilion near the eyes that turns blinking into punctuation, and notice how the wig frames the cheeks so that every angle gets rounded into invitation rather than challenge. And when the head turns just enough for the hairpins to whisper, you hear Yoshizawa, Ayami's old principle, without anyone quoting it aloud, that the role is not an act worn at curtain up, but a habit woven into standing, sitting, and even forgetting to sit when the tea arrives. The voice lands next high without squeak, resonant without weight, and the vowels lengthen like silk pulled from a cocoon, while the consonants keep house so the room doesn't flood with sweetness, and you catch court lady phrasing no samurai would use in council. Women's language cadences, threaded through jokes that never quite admit they're jokes, which makes the aisle seats lean in as if a teacher had just announced there would be no test, yet somehow everyone's posture improves. A Mai frozen pose arrives the way lightning arrives in summer, and the body holds a shape that looks effortless until you try it in your chair and learn how many fibers need to agree for one fingertip to hover and one shoulder to drop And in that stillness, the Onagata tilts the face a finger width toward the lanterns, so the white catches fire. And you understand why Shiraku's actor prints look fierce, even when the role is gentle, because technique reads as power, no matter the costume. You remember the timeline without sounding like a program note. Women banned from the stage in 1629, boys banned in 1652, adult men, Yaro Kabuki, taking every role. And you can see the solution being invented in front of you, like a bridge built, while the parade is already crossing. With stylists, wig makers, diction coaches, dance masters, and senior actors turning feminine into a craft toolkit instead of a mirror. Which is why an Onagata's sleeve can say, "Wait faster than a messenger on horseback." A quick change hikinuki rips a layer away, so the same performer can turn from maiden to matron in the span of one audience, gasp, and a black-clad stagehand becomes an accomplice. No one will accuse because invisibility is a uniform here, and you glance at the revolving stage, Mawari Butai, spinning a street into a riverbank without asking permission from geography, which is the sort of magic that makes you trust a theater, even when you don't trust the weather, or your calendar, or anything that keeps pretending to be solid out in the daylight. Backstage, you watch the rehearsal of a hand nothing more glamorous than how an Onagata grips a fan without revealing knuckles. How the elbow floats away from the rib cage by exactly 2 finger widths, how the knee points inward touch. So the stride reads as modesty instead of haste. And you realize you're watching keita fixed patterns collected like recipes that ensure the dish tastes like itself every time, even if the chef changes, which is why you can see a gesture in Edo and recognize it years later in Osaka without needing the playbill to remind you of the name. You steal time with a costumer who explains tooth blackening ohaguro as a historical code for married status that some roles emulate and hairlines plucked or lowered to match court fashion. So the silhouette whispers, era, even when the set only supplies 3 sliding screens and a borrowed branch of plum. And if you've ever admired how a modern period drama telegraphs century with a sleeve seam before anyone opens their mouth, you're already fluent in this kind of quiet timestamp. A patron in the next box debates Danjuro's Thunder Rolls Aragoto, all bold stripes and roaring me versus Kikunojo's soft-style delicacy Wagatu that lets emotion slosh right up to the rim without spilling. And you enjoy the argument because both schools sharpen each other the storm and the still pond, checking balance the way 2 friends keep a table from wobbling by pressing down different corners. And somewhere a boy in the cheap seats decides to mimic tonight's wrist tilt until it becomes the tick that lands him his first role in 3 summers. You linger on the economy of devotion that knits all this together. Actor guilds, fan clubs, portrait sellers outside the gate with stacks of Toyokuni and Kunisada faces. Tea houses that book, private mini performances, like living footnotes, to the main show. And you ask yourself, a small poll for the comments. Is there a transformation you've watched on stage or screen that made you believe your own walk could change the weather for 5 minutes if you learned where to bend your sleeve at exactly the right syllable in a song you didn't know you knew? You hear the authorities breathing too, sumptuary laws, adjusting widths of stripes patrols, checking haircut codes, edicts that try to keep admiration inside acceptable rails, and the theater answers with suggestion rather than defiance, pushing meaning into eyes. Timing fabric density, the way a lantern is lifted a thumb higher than regulation, so a cheekbone shines, which is not resistance with banners, but the quieter engineering of feeling that makes rules feel like furniture to walk around rather than walls to bang against until someone's head aches. A veteran Onagata ends a scene with a Rappo exit borrowed from heroic roles, but slowed, softened tuned to the line between curtain and corridor, and that mashup of vocabularies, feminine posture, borrowing a warrior's victory stride, then sanding it down to velvet, tells you more about the era's imagination than a shelf of treatises. That gender on this stage is less a gate and more a series of practiced doors with hinges oiled by music and memory, and the unteachable patience of breath-counting rice grains at midnight in a dressing room that smells of camellia oil and faint chalk. You watch a final duet where the Onagata sleeve lifts and drops like a tide marker, while the male lead's hand hovers close enough to be weathered, yet not touch a choreography invented partly for decency, partly for safety, and mostly to prove that distance when measured by a virtuoso can be louder than contact, which your seatmates understand without blinking, because this city has trained them to hear silence the way sailors hear wind shifts, even behind closed shutters on a calm night. You follow the smell of salt and incense down to a port where gulls heckle the ships, and a Jesuit house keeps its windows the polite width open, and you hear nibs dart across paper as letters to Europe try to make a tidy paragraph out of a country that resists tidy anything. A translator, the Tsuji, whose job is to turn words into sentences, rearranges your remarks the way a gardener reshapes a pine, and you feel how every word has to survive. 2 crossings, one over water, another over custom, which is why the margins of those letters end up packed with qualifiers, like cushions added to a chair that is just a little too sharp for long sitting. You catch the echo of earlier arrivals. Francis Xavier in 1549 stepping into a language that refuses Latin declensions. Alessandro Valignano later teaching his men to lean into local etiquette without losing doctrine. And you hear a voice, like Louis Frois, sharp and fascinated, composing lists that compare this place to Europe, item by item. He notes how nobles admire youths with a frankness that would startle a Lisbon salon. He notes theaters full of transformations and painted faces. He reaches for words he trusts and finds they do not quite fit, like traveling with cutlery that can't figure out how to handle chopsticks. Question for the insomniacs. Have you ever misjudged a festival by the confetti and then realized the floats had hydraulics and history under the paper flowers? In the Jesuit refectory, you listen to the debate that never finds a permanent home, how to be gracious about tea-verse and gift wrapping while drawing a hard line at certain intimacies preached against on Sunday. They admire order, cleanliness, punctuality that makes bells feel redundant, and they squint at Shudo as if it were an optical illusion made of politeness. Hierarchy and affection that refuses to report to their moral categories. A superior rubs his brow, writes in a calm hand, and resolves to counsel converts away from practices that the host society treats like elaborate manners, which you realize is collision by paragraph between 2 worlds that each think they invented common sense. You tilt forward when the talk shifts to law, because law will mow grass. The sermon only waves at. By 1614, the Tokugawa edicts push missionaries out and push Christianity into cellars, and whatever the Jesuits thought of kabuki and nanshoku stops mattering publicly, because their pens are now smuggling prayers instead of drafting cultural commentary. That vacuum fills with other voices, traders, whose churches are ledgers, physicians, whose pulpits are notebooks, and you walk the quay to meet the Dutch, who will spend centuries watching Japan from a small island with big eyes. Dejima sits in the Nagasaki Bay, like a keyhole, and the Dutch East India Company squeezes through it with bales, barrels, and periodic boredom that produces excellent note-taking. You hear Engelbert Kempfer in the 1690s filing details the way a botanist files leaves kabuki's transformations, licensed quarters humming like beehives, youths marked by hairstyle codes you already learned in the barracks, and his tone is more ethnography than sermon precise scribbles that make future readers think they're there by the canal with you, even if the writer only saw it from a sedan chair during a permitted excursion. A century later, Carl Peter Thunberg will add his own margin notes, that steady, curious gaze of a surgeon who notices 1,000 small things while waiting for a patient who never quite arrives. You peer through the island's gate with the English for a moment. Richard Cox at Hirado, scribbling about fashions and favors. William Adams translating more than words as he navigates a lord's household. And you see how foreign diaries keep calling male companionship common, regulated, and confusing to their imported sensibilities. The writers clock the visible signals, forelocks, sleeve lengths, the complement economy of poems and gifts, and then default to vocabulary from home that flattens what you have spent nights watching the etiquette against boasting the boundaries about age and status. The way sentiments and duties share the same doorway without tripping each other. You sit with a Dutch factor who is not allowed out much and yet collects a city and objects. Actor prints bought from peddlers, incense blends tucked into drawers, a small netski carved as a carp that he turns in his fingers when the sea wind sulks. He asks an interpreter about the Onagata and gets an answer that is correct and insufficient. A man who plays women, which is like saying tea is hot water with leaves, and forgetting choreography bowls, and the way the whisk writes foam like weather. He scrawls something respectful and slightly wrong, and you forgive him because he is translating a grammar of breath into a ledger that has never inhaled a stage sigh. You watch a missionary observe a samurai and his wakashu and miss the hinge when the forelock goes, and conduct changes treating the before and after as one continuous habit rather than two phases gated by ceremony and expectation. The oversight is not malicious. It is the cost of visiting a play for only the first and last acts. To him, the mentorship looks like indulgence. To the house steward, it looks like a timed apprenticeship with strict logging of favors and penalties for bragging the very rules you saw posted in the monastery and heard whispered in the barracks, which makes you wish you could lend him your nose so he could catch the clove and ink timing in the corridor and understand what season he's in. You read a Jesuit lament that kabuki corrupts youth, and a Dutch shrug that kabuki organizes it, and you place both on the table like two fans that cool different parts of the same room. The bans on women performers, then boys, the sumptuary regulations, that police fabric, the licensed districts that fence desire the way a garden fences water. These are administrative answers to human temperature, and each foreign account chooses a thermometer based on home climate. Have you ever brought your winter coat to a spring city and insisted the locals felt cold? Exactly that, but in prose with beautiful handwriting. You trail an Edo procession that escorts the Dutch to the shogun, a long, curated snake of gifts and specimens, and notice how much of the country they see is filtered through formality, and yet they still notice the peonies marching up a firefighter's back. The fans with poems folded into compartments the way a theater poster pins a whole neighborhood schedule into color. Kempfer writes it down. Thunberg sketches. Later readers stitch their notes into a Europe that will swear it knows this place intimately, because it owns 2 books and a vase, which is how reputations crystallize if nobody keeps walking the streets after the lanterns are put out. You stand again by the canal, where the theater quarter breathes on one bank, and the customs house breathes on the other, and you admit that every account, Jesuit Dutch English, comes with the bias of a window and the patience of a chair. The miracle is that even through those small frames, you can still glimpse the grammar you've been following since the barracks coded youth-disciplined affection, stagecraft, that teaches eyes to read politics, that perfumes decisions with clove and discretion. If you had to write one line to send home, would you choose the sermon's thunder or the botanist's leaf? The answer might say more about your weather than about the city you're trying to fold into an envelope by breakfast. You feel the city shed old skins faster than your eyes can track, top knots snipped by decree, swords surrendered to closets, crests folded into drawers, and the sound that used to be armor cords whispering turns into the click of military-issue boots on new parade grounds, while a Western brass band practices scales that taste like iron in the morning air. You look for the forelock that once told you who was liminal and who was grown, and it is gone shaved by policy and fashion until the calendar's hinge that timed pseudo etiquette has nothing left to grip. So the rules you memorized, gifts given during youth, vows that shift at adulthood, lose their scaffolding. The way a house loses its scaffolding, the day the builders decide the facade should now be stone with glass. You follow an official to a drafting table where laws take shape with imported pens, and he points at a sheet that borrows European phrasing to condemn unnatural acts in the early 1870s before another code arrives by 1880 that quietly drops the clause while keeping a louder net of public decency rules. And you understand how regulation can soften in one column and harden in another without admitting. Either move is about people you met in the barracks and the theater. You watch a police captain unfold a map of pleasure districts and redraw borders with a ruler that smells of new varnish and houses that once hired Kagema boys. Switch their signage, push some trades toward the shadows, and rehearse new euphemisms that still fit in ledgers when inspectors visit at dusk, which you read as discretion, shifting from taste to survival without changing its polite tone. You move through a schoolyard where boys in matching caps line up to sing an anthem, and you hear a teacher talk about frugality, diligence, and modern citizenship, while a dormitory matron pins a schedule to the corridor that leaves almost no unsupervised minutes on weeknights. And you recognize the monastery's old tool, a grid of time repurposed for a nation teaching itself to walk in step under gas lamps and telegraph wires. You step into a kabuki rehearsal hall where the onagata still practice a sleeve's breath and a downcast gaze that reads like a sentence, yet the room shares oxygen with a different stage across town. Shimpa, and then Shingeki, where actresses play wives and workers for audiences eager to see realism, and a promoter mentions Sadayako by name with the pride of someone who has stood in a foreign theater and heard applause that sounds like a ship opening its sails. You revisit the tea room etiquette you learned, and notice the small objects go even smaller. A poem's imagery swaps moon-on spear for train whistle after rain. A Netsuke carver tucks a tiny pocket watch face into the lid of a pillbox. A private scent adds a citrus note someone says is Parisian. And the same discretion that once kept corridor air breathable now keeps public conversation in a new key that can pass for modern without throwing old keepsakes away. You open a newspaper and see the vocabulary change shape in print. Moralists learn the word civilization. Doctors import hentai to label desires. They mean to measure journalists. Try dossier for same-sex affection and find the ink dries in columns that invite letters to the editor. And you watch as feeling becomes a case study and then a paragraph and then a debate staged under gaslight instead of under lanterns, which does not make the feeling newer, only noisier. You pass a barracks, rebuilt for conscripts, farm boys in uniform, former samurai. Now instructors who correct posture with a tap that sounds like a metronome. And you hear veterans trade the old vocabulary of vow and youth for the new vocabulary of unit cohesion. And a captain with a careful face tells you that supervision solves problems. Before sermons do a line you could have heard in a cloister or a castle if anyone back then had needed to pretend the solution came from Europe. You read a pamphlet by a thinker who admires trains and schoolhouses and urges the country to discard anything that might embarrass it in treaty ports, and the argument leans on foreign eyes as if they were mirrors held up to the archipelago, which you recognize as a kind of stage direction, written by an audience that has already decided which costumes look modern enough to applaud. You walk through a licensed quarter at twilight and catch the edits, the brighter lamps, the straighter alleys, the police box on the corner where a young officer studies a manual, and the old arts that once showcased coded youth now sell nostalgia, calibrated to pass inspection. So an actor print in a shop window shows an onagata in a pose everyone knows by heart, while the caption praises technique, never temperament. And the price tag is discreet enough to pass a censor with a stopwatch. You stand by a bridge and think of pairs, the chronicles named with the verbs attended and kept vigil. And you understand why later writers begin to describe them with other verbs entirely. Some clumsy, some clinical, some holding their breath to see if a new century will let them be precise without being punished. And you catch yourself asking the quiet poll for tonight. When language changes, do you change with it? Or do you let your memory keep its own dictionary in a drawer you only open after curfew? You follow a policeman down a side street to a station where a ledger lists charges that sound tidy: disturbance, indecency, disorder. And you notice how categories that fit street brawls and loud musicians can also be used to trim anything that makes a supervisor nervous, which is bureaucracy's favorite magic trick when it wants to appear neutral while rearranging furniture in people's private rooms. You visit a small print shop still selling Utagawa lineages to loyal fans, and the owner whispers that certain compositions sell better wrapped in paper that suggests historical interest. And you both smile because the city has always loved code, and now code has acquired a Western overcoat that scratches a little at the neck but looks good in photographs sent abroad. You watch students trade borrowed books. Mori Oge's Vita Sexualis passed with a shrug about dangerous ideas. Kafu's essays folded open to passages about quarters and modern taste. And you recognize how literature becomes a safe room, with windows a place where an old etiquette can be examined as art rather than prosecuted as conduct, which is one of the century's few mercies when it discovers the joy of labeling everything it can label. You end the evening at a public garden, remodeled after foreign parks, where paths loop around a pond that pretends nothing has changed in 200 years, and the wind brings you the old clove and ink trace from a passerby's sleeve, the way a radio catches a station from far away on a clear night, and you register the shift you've been tracking all day. Not disappearance, but discretion turning into a practice that spends less time polishing tokens and more time polishing silence until it gleams like lacquer in a gallery that refuses captions. You step off a subway at dusk and feel the city hum like a lacquer box with a Bluetooth speaker hidden inside, and somewhere under the neon, a faint clove note slips past a boutique's incense, a tea shop's doorway, and you catch yourself grinning because the corridor scent that timed councils and kabuki cues still knows how to find your sleeve without asking permission from the century. You drift through a bookshop where the literature shelves file sentries like soldiers at inspection, and Saikaku's tales share a row with paperbacks whose covers use English titles for mood and katakana for marketing. A clerk recommends a reprint of actor prints bound like an art book and a slim volume of poems about summer trains and borrowed yukata. And he does it with that smile that says the rumors of what people feel do not frighten him, because he shelves emotions for a living 8 hours a day without needing a content warning on the receipt. You notice a poster for a kabuki program, Onagata, listed in elegant brush, a name you recognize from late-night documentaries, and remember how a sleeve could say, "Wait faster" than a messenger, and the theater still trades in that grammar. The house lights dim. The Hanamichi glows. A-me holds the air, hostage for 3 heartbeats, and the gesture looks old enough to be carved and fresh enough to be oxygen, which you realize is exactly the trick you've been watching since the Forelock years were a calendar item instead of a museum label. You cross town to a Takarazuka poster where women in tailcoats smolder at the camera with the confidence of a thunder god who found a couture stylist, and you clock the mirror play kabuki perfecting femininity through male bodies. Takarazuka perfecting masculinity through female bodies, both drilling posture and breath until the stage stops asking for gender and starts asking for technique, which is a conversation the wider street is finally having out loud, even if its outdoor voice still cracks, sometimes on the high notes. You take a quiet detour through an art gallery showing photographs from the 1960s, where sculpted bodies pose like ancient armor, learned ballet, and the camera's eye does not apologize for wanting to make a statue out of a pulse. And you hear a guide whisper about Aiko Hosoe and a certain novelist who loved steel myths and ritual, and you file the whisper under aesthetic arguments, disguised as portraits rather than biographies at Volume 12. Because the respectful way to read the image is to notice the craft first light angle, how chiaroscuro still behaves like stage powder for a lens that learned to speak in monochrome. You wander past a manga store where a display bows to the year 24. Group, those shoujo pioneers who painted boys with starlight bones and cathedral eyes so big they could house weather, and you recognize how their dream world romances made room for talking about love sideways when forward was too loud. Modern shelves label a genre and argue over subgenres because naming helps buyers find the right box, but the oldest trick remains the same: stylized to de-escalate. Give the heart a cloak of line and tone, and let readers practice empathy without tripping the alarms that go off when a newspaper tries to run the same conversation without sparkles. You let the train rock you to Shinjuku Nichome, where bars hide behind curtains of light and doors announce themselves with a bell you could mistake for Temple's miniature cousin, and the neighborhood greets you with the practical hospitality of a notice board that lists karaoke hours, happy hour rules, and the kind of don't be a jerk policy that monk stewards and moderators across time would high-five for clarity. A bartender pours highballs with the elegance of a tea master and nods at a wall crowded with flyers for community events, film nights, and a parade date circled like a birthday. You pocket a leaflet and think of how licensed quarters once organized feeling into safe corridors, and how this street does the same job with different paperwork and louder laughter. You pass a ward office, kiosk, with pamphlets about partnership, certificates, and counseling lines printed in fonts that try to look friendly without trying too hard. And you note the bureaucratic bravery of small steps that become stairs when stacked forms that don't laugh at you. Clerks who learn not to make a face signage that speaks in the plain, tense, instead of a labyrinth. All of it painstaking and unsexy and vital the way a well-fitted floorboard is vital when a house intends to hold dancing. You angle into a stationery shop and find the old tech waiting Waka notebooks, cinnabar paste for seals, embossers that can put your name into an envelope with the authority of a tiny drum. A pair near the pens chooses a waistband charm, modern kinchaku with a concealed tag, and the clerk praises the fabric's durability the way a Netsky carver once praised grain. And you can hear the sentence underneath the sales pitch. If it's built to last, it's built to keep quiet without breaking, which is how affection survives audits. Whether the auditor is a castle steward, a schoolmaster, or a nosy timeline. You catch an incense workshop where Genjiko pattern cards sit beside a phone app that logs your guesses like a game score. And you grin because the smell that once timed counsel and rendezvous now times a mindfulness moment you can export to a calendar subscription. The instructor jokes that every blend has a season, which you translate as every affection has a meter, and you mark your card with a confident clove cedar agarwood like a student who studied for the test by living in the archive disguised as a city. You spend an evening at a small theater where a drag performer uses an onagata wrist and a takarazuka bow, and a stand-up comic's mic control, and the set builds toward a joke about paperwork that lands with the relief of a stamp hitting ink, and the crowd laughs with the disciplined kindness of people who understand timing, saves lives in wooden buildings and fragile friendships. And you wash down the joke with soda and lime, because a gentle night does not need anything sharper to keep its balance. You browse a museum shop where the postcard rack offers Shiriku's piercing faces, Kuniyoshi's rogues, and a firefighter's tattooed back, folding like a curtain across a river of muscle. And you wonder aloud which one would sit above your desk and which one would hide inside a travel chest like a tanzaku saved for a late train. And the cashier votes for the rogue, because outlaws understand how to keep promises that never make it into policy handbooks, at least on the days when ink behaves. You step into a public garden where a group practices tea under maples, where a kid studies a sword dance kata without any swords, where an older couple trades short verses about autumn and logistics, and the city feels like a rehearsal hall that refuses to close, and the air keeps offering you the old props, paper cord scent gesture, not as relics, but as tools that still fit human hands. Even after the calendar traded top knots for commuter passes and the battlefield for spreadsheets that sometimes smell like fear at quarter's end. You lean on the bridge rail and watch the water print the city upside down again. And you can almost hear the soft click of a fan, the hiss of a brush, the tap of a tabori needle counting patience, the low laugh from a backstage where someone warms their hands and a sentence at the same time, and you take inventory like a steward with a kind face Coded youth turned into vocabulary lessons, stagecraft, teaching, courage to move without shouting, politics, learning to borrow tenderness from the tea room neighborhoods, turning euphemism into community policy, and through all of it, that small, defiant craft, the country keeps making room under rules and rumors and renovations for a sleeve to say what a sermon cannot, while the lantern pretends to be surprised by how warm your hands are tonight. So having wandered through the quiet corridors of coded affection, the clove-scented poetry, and the stagecraft that could turn a sleeve into a love letter, you might think you've got feudal Japan figured out. But here's the twist. Those same polished rituals lived inside a world that was far from gentle to the unprepared. Beyond the tea rooms and theater lights lay rules sharp enough to cut your day short if you tripped over them. Hierarchy wasn't just a suggestion. Etiquette wasn't a polite hobby. And survival required reading a room faster than a samurai could draw a blade. In other words, step outside the floating world's embrace, and you'd find yourself auditioning for a role you never rehearsed. You wake before the rooster, not because you're eager to greet the dawn, but because the smell of damp straw and the distant creak of the village water wheel remind you that the day's work began before you even opened your eyes. The light leaking through the paper shoji is pale, the kind that makes you wonder if the sun itself is still deciding whether it's worth getting up. But you don't have the luxury of choice. Your rice field waits, and the Lord's tax collectors don't accept excuses. The first mouthful of the morning isn't even yours. Half of what you grew last season was already carted away in sacks marked with the crest of your daimyo, and another portion went to the temple in donations you never actually volunteered. What's left enough to fill your family's bellies most days, but not enough to let you forget the empty days in the lean months. The rice tax isn't calculated in kindness. It's measured in koku, the amount of grain that can feed one person for a year. Your land's yield is measured carefully, and the best harvest always seems to belong to someone else before you've even tied straw bundles. By mid-morning, you're knee-deep in water, and muck toes curling into the cool sludge as you bend at the waist, planting seedlings in neat lines. The rhythm is hypnotic, bend plant, step repeat, but your back complains after the first hour, and your mind wanders to the absurd math of survival here. You labor from dawn to dusk for a yield that you will never fully taste. If you're lucky, the weather will be your friend. If not, a late frost, a summer drought, or an early typhoon can turn all this bending and planting into nothing more than a memory of effort. The fields are shared in spirit, but not in ownership. You can see your neighbors at the far end of the paddies, their straw hats bobbing like slow-moving lanterns in the heat haze. There's a quiet camaraderie in this shared misery, but also a certain vigilance. Everyone knows who works hard and who tries to coast. In a village where food is survival, reputations are as important as tools. You wonder if centuries from now people will romanticize this life paintings of golden paddies and rustic cottages, forgetting the blisters. The mosquito swarms the ache that sets into your spine before you're even halfway through the season. And then there's the Lord Steward, the man who counts your harvest with the precision of a merchant weighing gold dust. He's not cruel in the obvious way. No shouting, no threats, but his eyes measure the stacks of sheaves with a hunger that isn't his own. You know the history in the Sengoku period. Rice wasn't just food, it was currency. Daimyo used koku not only to feed armies, but to pay retainers build castles and keep their standing among rival lords. You standing here with mud up to your knees are simply the first link in that chain of wealth and power. The irony is that rice is considered sacred. Shinto rituals bless the planting, and the harvest priests wave gohei wands over seedlings, and festivals celebrate the first taste of the new crop. But sacred or not, it still vanishes from your storehouse as if spirited away by invisible hands. You remember the story of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who rose from peasant origins to become ruler of Japan. Even he, the great unifier, relied on the same rice levy system, proving that the climb to power didn't erase the habit of squeezing the people at the bottom. The physical strain is matched by a constant mental calculation. You keep a careful tally in your head, how much to set aside for family, how much for seed, how much will be requested for festivals or repairs to the village bridge. The bridge always seems to need repairs. It's easy to joke that the only thing more fragile than a rice stalk is the promise that the tax will ever decrease. Your hands slick with mud, sometimes pause over a perfect seedling, and you imagine what it would be like to keep all of it to fill the storehouse until it bursts to eat white rice every day, instead of stretching it with millet or barley. White rice is for special occasions, now weddings or New Year's. And even then you measure each portion carefully. Modern people might complain about skipping lunch or missing their morning coffee, but here, a poor harvest could mean no lunch for weeks. As the sun climbs higher, the air thickens with humidity wrapping around you like a damp futon. You swat at a mosquito, nearly losing your balance, and chuckle to yourself. What would those samurai, in their lacquered armor, think if they knew the real enemy of the rice farmer was a swarm of tiny whining insects? You've heard tales of how some lords tried to boost morale with small gifts, a barrel of sake after a good harvest perhaps. But more often than not, your reward is the chance to do it all again next year. By the time you break for a meager midday meal, cold rice balls wrapped in pickled leaves, you've already been working for hours. You eat slowly, not because you want to savor it, but because making it last feels like a small act of defiance. You glance toward the steward's storehouse in the distance, its thick earthen walls promising cool, rodent-free storage for grain you will never touch. Somewhere inside the sacks from your field rest in the dark, waiting to be tallied, traded, or consumed by people who have never set foot in the mud. It's hard not to feel the weight of the system pressing down on you, but there's a strange stability in it too. You know your role, your obligations, your place in the unspoken hierarchy. It isn't fair, but it is predictable. And in feudal Japan, predictability is its own kind of comfort. You brush the mud from your legs and change into your second-best robe, the one without obvious tears, because tonight's reward for a day in the fields is not a feast or a festival, but a trip to the communal bathhouse. You'd think a place meant for relaxation would be free of stress, but in feudal Japan, even the bath has a social order sharper than a samurai's blade. The air inside is heavy with steam, carrying the earthy smell of wet wood and faint traces of pine from the buckets. At first, it feels almost welcoming, like stepping into a warm cloud after a cold rain. But you don't just plop down anywhere. The moment you cross the threshold, the rules, unwritten but ironclad, begin to assert themselves. High-ranking samurai get the hottest water and the best corner spots where they can sit undisturbed. Merchants, though wealthy, still rank lower and often cluster together in the middle. Farmers and artisans like you keep to the sides, letting the scalding luxury of the center remain untouched. It's not just about where you sit, but how you behave. You pour water over yourself before entering the main tub, careful not to splash anyone. A stray splash on the wrong person could earn you a glare, or worse, a silent grudge carried into market day. The bath is a place where grudges simmer as quietly as the water. You've heard tales of villages where disputes over bathhouse etiquette spiraled into full-blown feuds, the kind where swords eventually came out. And then there's the matter of timing. The Lord's retainers often bathe, first leaving the water cooler and sometimes cloudy by the time commoners like you enter. You pretend not to notice, lowering yourself in with a neutral expression, though your mind drifts to how modern people might complain if their spa day came with a side of lukewarm water and secondhand suds. Conversation flows as steadily as the hot water. Men discuss crop yields, local gossip, or the latest rumors from Edo word of a new shogunal edict, or perhaps the rise and fall of a favorite kabuki actor. You might hear someone mention the great bathhouses of Kyoto, where cedar tubs are so large they could hold a small fishing boat, and attendants circulate with towels and cups of tea. But here, in your rural outpost, the luxury is smaller, simpler, and bound by the same hierarchy that governs the fields and the streets. You remember hearing about Senno Rikyu, the tea master, whose influence reached the highest echelons of power. Even in something as seemingly simple as tea preparation or bathing rituals, status was displayed in subtle ritualized ways. A lord might enter the bathhouse surrounded by attendants, his towel handed to him as if it were a ceremonial object. You, in contrast, fold your own towel and guard it from slipping into the water. There's also the unspoken theater of endurance. How long can you stay in the heat without wincing? Can you maintain a composed face while your skin prickles and your head feels light? To leave too soon suggests weakness. To linger too long risks fainting in front of everyone. Either way, you're remembered. You notice an older farmer across from you, his back bent from decades of planting. He sits in silence, eyes half closed, radiating the kind of stoicism that comes from surviving more winters than you've yet faced. No one disturbs him. In a way, he's earned his own kind of status, not through wealth or weaponry, but through endurance. Outside the bathing area, the dressing space is lined with simple wooden shelves for clothing. Your robe, folded neatly, rests beside those of your neighbors. Here, privacy is a concept as foreign as ice in summer. People glance at each other openly, noting who has a new sash, whose robe has been patched, who's lost weight since the last visit. It's a silent ledger of the village's fortunes and misfortunes. For a moment, you think about how the bathhouse is both a great equalizer and a great divider. Everyone ends up stripped of armor, swords, and fine clothes, but the rules still cling to the skin. It's a place to cleanse the body, yes, but also to reaffirm the order of things. In a society where even steam can't blur the lines of rank, you learn to navigate the currents quietly, like slipping into the water without making a ripple. When you finally leave, your skin tingles from the heat and your head feels pleasantly heavy. The cool night air hits you like a second bath, this one drawn from the stars. You step into your sandals, the dampness of your freshly cleaned feet already picking up specks of dust from the path home. The bathhouse fades behind you, replaced by the quiet rustle of bamboo in the breeze, and you realize that tomorrow will demand the same labor as today. The next morning, your legs still feel a little loose from yesterday's bath, but you have errands that take you along the main road. And on a main road in feudal Japan, there's one unspoken law carved deeper than any edict from Edo. Watch how you move when a samurai approaches. Not just because they carry swords, but because their right to use them on you is more than a rumor. It's a legally recognized privilege. The dirt path is narrow, worn smooth by feet hooves, and the iron-bound wheels of merchant carts. You walk along the edge, eyes naturally scanning the horizon, and then you see them, a pair of men in layered silk robes, swords at their hips, straw hats tilted just enough to shadow their faces. Their steps are slow, deliberate, the way people move when they have nothing to prove but the power to make others wait. You already know the drill: step a side bow, slightly avoid locking eyes for too long. Not because a glance is forbidden, but because a lingering one can be read as a challenge. In a society built on status, the road itself is a stage, and every meeting is a silent performance of who matters more. A slip here isn't just embarrassing, it can be deadly. The Edo period law of Kirisute Gomen allowed a samurai to cut down a commoner who disrespected them, provided it could be justified as a matter of honor. That justification could be as thin as a blade of grass. You think of modern-day street etiquette. Maybe someone gets annoyed if you bump shoulders without saying sorry. But here, the stakes are sharp enough to leave a scar. You remember the story of Asano Naganori, whose clash with Kira Yoshinaka in the shogun's palace led to his forced seppuku. That feud, immortalized in the tale of the 47 Ronin, began over perceived slights and breaches of protocol. If men of high rank could lose everything over a botched bow or poorly chosen words, what chance does a rice farmer have? As the samurai draw closer, you shift to the side, feet crunching in the gravel. You keep your hands visible, your posture respectful, and your gaze angled just enough to acknowledge their presence without intruding on it. The elder of the two passes without a flicker of expression, but the younger lets his eyes rest on you for a heartbeat too long. Maybe he's assessing whether you understand your place, or maybe he's simply bored. Either way, your pulse doesn't slow until their figures are reduced to specks behind you. The rules extend beyond the meeting itself. If you're carrying something, a basket of vegetables, a bundle of firewood, you shift it to the far side away from the swords so there's no chance of brushing against them. You keep your speech short if spoken to, answering directly but never with more detail than asked. The road is not the place for small talk unless you're of equal standing. It's strange to think that even the simple act of traveling is shaped by who you might meet along the way. Merchants keep to the middle stretches, where they can stop at tea houses, their goods packed tightly in wicker chests. Peasants tend to hug the shoulders, staying out of the main flow, unless they're part of a larger group headed to market or a festival. Ronin, masterless samurai, move like men caught between worlds, still entitled to a certain respect, but stripped of the banner that once guaranteed it. You step off the road briefly to let a procession pass a lord's entourage, perhaps returning from a shrine visit. At the center is a palanquin, its lacquer gleaming even under the dusty sun, carried by 4 sweating porters. Inside, silk curtains sway with each step, revealing nothing of the passenger but the faint glint of gold thread. Even without seeing them, you know your placehead, lowered, body angled away, as if your very gaze might be an intrusion. There's a part of you that wonders how exhausting it must be to live on the top rung, always watched, always expecting deference. But that's a thought you keep to yourself. Here, the hierarchy is as much a part of the landscape as the pine-covered hills. You don't question the mountains for being tall, And you don't question the samurai for walking as if they own the road, because in a sense, they do. When the path widens again, and you see only fellow farmers ahead, your shoulders loosen. Conversation starts up. Someone mentions a rumor about a traveling sword instructor setting up in the next town. You laugh quietly at the thought of taking lessons. For you, the sword is less a tool for battle and more a reminder of the invisible lines you walk every day. By the time the village rooftops come into view, the dust on your feet is a thin crust, and the rhythm of your steps has eased back into the casual pace of someone who's no longer under scrutiny. But you still glance over your shoulder once more, just to be sure. The rooftops barely fade from view before you're drawn back into the rhythm that keeps every household running. There's no season in feudal Japan when you can truly rest, only seasons when the work changes its shape. The spring planting has its back-breaking mud, summer has its weeding, and pest-chasing autumn has its harvest, and winter, well, winter has all the tasks you postponed because you were too busy in the fields. Right now, the rice seedlings in your paddies are taking root, so your mornings begin with careful inspections for signs of damage. A single night of ducks wandering in, or worse, the silent nibbling of snails, can undo days of work. You stoop low, scanning the rows, your shadow falling across the delicate green shoots. The water glints with the reflection of clouds, and you think about how it takes a kind of stubborn hope to believe these fragile stalks will one day turn into something you can hold weigh and eat. After the paddies, there's firewood to gather. You head to the edge of the forest, carrying a short-handled axe that's been sharpened so many times it has a slight curve from wear. The undergrowth crackles underfoot, the smell of pine sap clinging to the air. You take what's dry, stacking it into a bundle you can carry without losing your balance on the uneven path. Every piece has to be hauled back by hand, no oxen for small folk like you. In winter, this firewood will be your shield against the cold that seeps into your bones, no matter how many layers you wear. Afternoons might mean spinning silk if your household keeps silkworms a delicate process that turns the small, fragile cocoons into strong, gleaming thread. The spinning wheel hums softly as you turn it, the thread winding into neat skeins. You remember hearing about how, in the more prosperous regions, whole villages specialized in silk production, their work coveted by merchants who could sell it in Kyoto for a small fortune. In your case, the silk is mostly for barter, maybe a small amount set aside for a family member's wedding garment. Then there are the repairs roofs, patched with fresh thatch walls, repapered with new shoji panels tools mended before they give out entirely. It's easy to forget that every tool here is an investment of hours, even days. The wooden handle of your hoe isn't just carved from any branch, it's selected, shaped, and smoothed so it won't split under pressure. Modern people can replace a broken item with a quick trip to the store. You have to plan repairs like a military campaign. There's also the unglamorous business of keeping pests out of storage. Rats are cleverer than you'd like to admit, and the earthen storehouses aren't impenetrable. You set traps, patch holes, and sometimes sit in the dim interior just to listen for the faint rustle of something you'd rather not find. It's tedious, but a lost sack of rice isn't just an inconvenience, it can mean hunger when the snow falls. Evenings bring their own kind of labor. Women in the household might sit by the aurori hearth, sewing, or mending clothes, their hands moving automatically in the flickering light. Men might carve new handles for tools or weave rope from rice straw. Children, if they're old enough, are put to work too, braiding cord, sorting seeds, or simply keeping the fire going. And there's no weekend to break the cycle. Festivals, yes, but those are work in their own way, preparing food, making offerings, dressing in clean garments, and tidying the home for guests or inspections. You might find yourself up before dawn to prepare for a local shrine's annual ritual, balancing trays of offerings as you walk in a procession that's equal parts devotion and obligation. The year's rhythm is so ingrained that you can predict your tasks months in advance. This predictability has its comfort, but it also makes you acutely aware of how little room there is for change. If the harvest is good, you work. If it's bad, you work harder. There's no escape from the cycle, only the small variations that come with weather and luck. Sometimes you think about the lives of those at the top, the lords, the high-ranking merchants, the samurai, who don't have to plant or harvest. The seasonal work is different, managing accounts, negotiating alliances, preparing for war. They may carry different burdens, but they have something you don't servants to carry them. By the time the day's last task is done, the sun has dipped low, turning the paddies into mirrors of orange and gold. You stretch your back, feeling every muscle complain, and head inside. The smell of miso soup greets you, simple but satisfying. Tomorrow will be much the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. Here, the future isn't a mystery. It's just a longer version of today. The temple bells reach you before you even see the tiled roof, deep resonant notes that roll down the hillside and mix with the sound of wind in the cedars. You follow the narrow path, worn smooth by countless sandals, past stone lanterns streaked with moss. Temples in feudal Japan are more than places of worship. They are schools, news centers, and sometimes the only public building where you can find a dry corner on a rainy day. The wooden gate looms ahead, its beams darkened by centuries of weather, and you step through into the courtyard. A monk in plain robes sweeps fallen leaves into neat piles, his movements calm, almost meditative. You nod a greeting, and he returns it with a slight bow before resuming his work. It's not just politeness. The temple depends on the goodwill of the villagers, and you depend on the temple in return. Inside, the air smells faintly of incense and old wood. Here, education is as much a spiritual duty as a practical one. Young boys, usually from families who can spare them from fields, sit cross-legged on straw mats, reciting characters from wooden tablets. The writing system is a mix of borrowed Chinese characters and native kana. And while most farmers never learn to write more than their own name, the temple offers a chance for literacy if you're persistent. You watch for a moment, noting how the monk corrects a stroke with the same patience he might use to tend a garden. But the temple's role isn't purely about spiritual or intellectual nourishment. It's also a hub for information. Travelers stop here to rest, and with them come scraps of news, a new road being built in a neighboring province, a dispute between two lords, the rise of a kabuki troupe in Kyoto that everyone seems to be talking about. In a world without printed newspapers for the common folk, these bits of gossip and updates are the threads from which you weave your understanding of the wider world. Of course, the temple has its own needs. Donations are not optional in the way a passerby might imagine. The wooden offering box near the altar seems to stare at you with open patience, as if it knows you'll contribute sooner or later. Sometimes it's a few coins, sometimes a bundle of rice, sometimes labor helping repair a roof tile, sweeping the garden, or carrying water. The balance is delicate. The monks live simply, but they also know how to ensure the temple's upkeep without seeming greedy. You've heard of grander temples in Nara or Kyoto, where the grounds sprawl like small towns and gold leaf glitters on the statues. But even here, in this modest rural setting, there's an artistry to the carved beams, the painted screens, and the way the garden seems to arrange itself in perfect harmony. The influence of Zen aesthetics shows in every line and shadow, and you can't help but admire it even if you came here today more for the shade than the sutras. Sometimes the monks organize festivals or rituals that draw the whole village. Lanterns line the path, food stalls appear, and the air fills with chanting. These events are spiritual, yes, but they also reinforce the social fabric, reminding everyone of their place and their connections. The temple is the one place where the samurai, the merchant, and the farmer might all kneel in the same hall, if only for a moment. There's also a more practical side to the monks' work. Some keep small medicinal gardens offering remedies for ailments that might otherwise fester. Others record births, deaths, and notable events, creating a ledger of village life that will outlast any single family's memory. And while Buddhism is the guiding philosophy here, the monks aren't above blending it with Shinto practices, ensuring that the temple remains relevant to everyone in the community. You sit for a while on the engawa, the wooden veranda, watching the light shift through the trees. A young acolyte brings you a small cup of tea, and you accept it with both hands. The tea is bitter, but it warms you in a way that feels older than taste. This small gesture reminds you that while the temple gives knowledge and shelter, it also subtly teaches humility, both in how you receive and how you give. By the time you rise to leave, the bell is sounding again, marking the late afternoon. You step back through the gate, the air cooler now, and follow the path home. The world outside the temple walls feels a little louder, a little rougher, but the rhythm of the bell stays in your ears. The temple's calm fades the moment you step into the wider world of clan politics, a landscape where alliances shift faster than the clouds over the mountains. You don't need to be a samurai to feel the weight of it. Even a farmer in a quiet village can sense when the air changes, when messengers ride faster, when people speak in shorter sentences. Feudal Japan isn't a patchwork of peaceful fiefs. It's a chessboard, and everyone is a piece, even if most of you are pawns. You hear the first hint. In passing a merchant, muttering to another about a retainer who's been recalled to his lord's castle. Then an elder in the village warns you to keep your head down. There's word of a border dispute between two daimyo, just 3 valleys over. These aren't abstract rumors. They can turn into troop movements overnight. Soldiers eat rice, and rice comes from you. A war in the distance can drain your storehouse just as surely as a flood in your own field. The system thrives on hostage exchanges, though no one calls them that outright. A daimyo might send a son to live in the shogun's capital for education, but everyone understands it's a leash disguised as an honor. In return, the shogun's own relatives might be guests in other domains, their freedom just polite enough to keep things from turning bloody too soon. You've heard tales of how the Tokugawa shogunate perfected this, requiring lords to spend alternate years in Edo under the policy of sankinkotai, a practice meant to prevent rebellion, but which also drained their coffers and kept them busy building lavish processions instead of armies. From your place in the fields, you see only the edges of these maneuvers, but those edges can cut. A sudden call for men to work on fortifications or to supply extra grain for the good of the realm means your own family has less. Sometimes, a neighboring village loses its able-bodied men, to conscription, leaving only the elderly and children to tend the paddies. And when the power shifts, it's not always clear who you're supposed to bow to. You remember an old story from your grandfather about the time when two rival lords disputed a stretch of forest. The villagers kept their mouths shut and their eyes averted, even as both sides claimed the same trees. In the end, the one with more soldiers won, but the villagers still had to pay tax to the losing side for 2 more seasons before anyone dared stop. Loyalty in such cases is less about honor and more about survival. Even castles, those symbols of might, can feel oddly fragile when you live in their shadow. One season, they're bustling with retainers, musicians, and messengers. The next, their stripped bare banners gone, the lord having moved on to secure another front. You've seen retainers wearing their clan crests, with pride 1 month only, to quietly replace them with new insignia the next, as if repainting a fence. Festivals and markets still happen, but there's a tension in the air when politics turns volatile. People speak less freely. Gossip becomes more guarded. The kabuki plays you've heard of, full of heroic loyalty and noble sacrifice, might make it seem like everyone here lives by unshakable codes. The truth is murkier. Loyalty is a performance, and most people are careful about when and where to act their part. Sometimes you wonder what it would be like to have a voice in any of this, to be one of the lords who decides which banner to raise, which ally to flatter, which rival to undermine. But you also know the price of being close to power. Fall out of favor, and you don't just lose land, you can lose your head. Even men as powerful as Akechi Mitsuhide, who famously turned against Oda Nobunaga, found that one gamble could end in ruin within days. As a commoner, you navigate this world by reading the signs others miss, the colors on a messenger's sash, the direction a group of armed men is traveling, the sudden appearance of more guards on the road. You learn when to keep your distance from the castle town and when to visit so you can blend in with the crowd. At night, when you hear the distant sound of a conch shell or the clang of a watchman's gong, you can't help but imagine the larger game unfolding beyond the dark hills. You don't know all the players, but you know enough to understand that in feudal Japan, peace is less the absence of war and more a pause between strategies. The political whispers fade once you're back inside the village gates, but night here is never entirely quiet. Darkness has its own rules, and you're part of the team that enforces them, at least in theory. Every household takes turns on the ban Yaku the Night Watch, which means you spend hours pacing the narrow lanes and keeping an ear out for anything that shouldn't be there. The wooden gates at the village's edge are already shut by the time your shift begins, their heavy beams slid into place with a thud that feels final. Outside, the road vanishes into darkness. Inside, the only light comes from paper lanterns swaying faintly in the evening breeze. You hold one yourself, its glow, casting just enough illumination to make the shadows sharper. Somewhere above, a nightbird calls, and the sound seems unnervingly close. Your job isn't to fight, at least not unless you absolutely have to. You're there to deter trouble, to let potential thieves or bandits know that someone is watching. The threats aren't always human. Stray dogs sometimes wander in, drawn by the scent of drying fish or fermenting pickles. A startled dog can bite as readily as any desperate man. And then there's fire, the fear that keeps every watchman's senses sharpened. In a village of wooden houses and paper walls, a single candle knocked over can erase decades in an hour. You walk your route slowly listening. A cough behind a thin wall. the muffled clink of pottery, the quiet rush of the stream just outside the east wall. You tap the haft of your wooden staff against the ground, at intervals a signal to anyone awake that the patrol is passing. In some towns, watchmen even sing or chant as they walk, not for entertainment, but as proof of alertness. Here, silence feels safer. Every so often, you pause to check the latch on a storage shed or glance at the shadows between houses. It's easy to imagine shapes shifting there, men crouch, low eyes glinting. But most nights, there's nothing. That's when the hardest enemy creeps in: boredom. Long hours with nothing to break them, but the slow passage of the moon can wear you down, make you careless. You think of Edo, where professional night watchmen haikishi in certain districts patrol with lanterns painted in their guild colors, part fire brigade, part police. They're known for being loud, even brash, but in the countryside, noise is a risk. You keep your lantern shielded when the wind picks up your ears, doing as much work as your eyes. From time to time, the watch also deals with the shogunate's own agents, inspectors or tax collectors who arrive late, perhaps intentionally to catch people off guard. A knock after dark can turn a calm night into a scramble, especially if the visitor demands to see grain stores or asks for names you'd rather not say out loud. You've seen the tension ripple through a household in those moments: who speaks, who stays silent, who suddenly remembers a chore in another room. You pass the north gate and nod to the other watchman on duty tonight, an older man with a face creased like an old rice sack. He grins slightly as if to say, "All quiet," and continues his slow pacing. The two of you will switch routes in another hour, each retracing the other's steps. It's not about mistrust. It's about making sure no corner of the village is left unseen for too long. Somewhere along the back lane, you hear movement, a faint rustle near the wall. You lift your lantern, its light catching the quick, guilty flicker of a boy's face before he bolts. Probably sneaking home after visiting a friend, maybe with a stolen persimmon or two in his sleeve. You could chase him, but you let him go. The watch isn't about punishing every small offense. It's about keeping the bigger dangers at bay. By the time your shift ends, the air has grown colder, the kind of chill that sinks into your sleeves and makes your fingers stiff. You hand your lantern to the next watchman and head home, the sound of his footsteps fading as you slide your own door shut. Inside, the faint smell of smoldering embers greets you, and for a moment you realize the night watch is less about guarding others and more about preserving the fragile sense that the village is still safe when you wake. Morning comes with a cool breeze off the hills, and as you dress, you think about the unspoken rule of clothing in your world. What you wear can save you, or it can ruin you. This isn't just about warmth or comfort. It's about survival in a society where people read your garments the way modern folks read job titles or social media profiles. You reach for your hemp robe first, the kind that fades into the background. It's undyed, sturdy, and says, "I'm no one important, please overlook me." This is your safe choice for market days, when you might cross paths with people of higher rank. Flashy silk in the wrong place could mark you as a thief, a braggart, or someone who needs to be reminded of their station. Silk, of course, has its place. A short jacket of indigo-dyed silk might come out for weddings, festivals, or the rare audience with a local lord. But even then, it's risky. In the Tokugawa period, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Peasants were often forbidden from wearing certain colors or fabrics, no matter how much they could afford. Merchants, despite their wealth, also had to downplay their success in clothing. Lavish patterns might be reserved for the inside lining of a kimono hidden from casual view, but still there as a private boast. You think of the famous kabuki actor Ichikawa Danjuro, who could stride onto a stage draped in colors and patterns that would get a commoner fined or worse. On stage, clothing was costume, and costume was immunity. But here, on the dusty road to the market, your clothing is a declaration of your place in the world, and there's no curtain to hide behind. Even color carries weight. Bright crimson might signal wealth or status, but it could also draw unwanted attention. Subdued browns and blues are safer, especially for travel. Dyed fabrics fade too, and in their wear, they reveal stories, how often you've worked, how well you've cared for what you own, whether you've had the means to replace or repair it. A neatly patched sleeve says thrifty. A fraying hem says struggling. People notice. For footwear, straw sandals, waraji are the usual choice, cheap and replaceable, but prone to wearing through in a few days if you're walking long distances. Wooden clogs get to keep you out of the mud, but clack loudly on hard ground, announcing your presence, whether you want it or not. Samurai and wealthier townsfolk might wear soft tabi socks with their footwear, a small luxury of comfort and cleanliness that peasants often go without. Jewelry, almost non-existent unless you're in the merchant or artisan class, and even then, it's modest hairpins, small netsuke toggles for holding pouches. Anything more elaborate risks attracting thieves or worse officials wondering how you came by such an item. You dress with these calculations in mind, tying your sash with practiced ease. If today were a festival, you might add a second sash in a brighter color or tuck a small charm into your sleeve. For now, you keep it simple. The goal is to blend in, to move through the day without inviting the wrong kind of curiosity. The irony, of course, is that even plain clothing requires constant upkeep. Hemp fibers, fray dyes fade, and every wash wears the fabric thinner. Mending is as regular as eating. You keep a small pouch of needles and thread for quick repairs. Sometimes, old garments are unpicked and re-dyed, given a second life in a new color, or cut down into clothing for children. Nothing is wasted, because replacing clothing outright is expensive and often impossible without barter. As you step outside, you notice your neighbor in a fresh indigo robe, the pattern faint but intricate if you look closely. He must have spent weeks weaving or trading for that cloth. You nod a silent acknowledgement of his quiet success. In a village like this, everyone reads the fabric before they read the face. You start down the road toward the day's errands, the morning light catching on the folds of your robe. You've dressed not for vanity, but for self-preservation. It's a strange thought that what touches your skin could be as much a shield as any weapon. But here, in the unspoken language of cloth, it's a truth you can't ignore. The road into the market town is busier than usual, a ribbon of dust and chatter winding toward the square. You follow it with the same mix of anticipation and caution every villager learns. Early market day is both opportunity and hazard. Here, you can trade what you've worked so hard to produce for the things you can't make yourself, salt fish tools, maybe even a scrap of imported cloth. But it's also where sharp eyes, quick hands, and loose tongues can undo you faster than a bad harvest. The market sprawls along a main street, lined with wooden stalls, the air thick with competing scents, grilled river fish, sizzling over charcoal pickled vegetables, in open barrels, fresh-cut cedar from a carpenter's table. Navigate the crowd slowly, your pouch of coins tied firmly inside your sash. The vendors call out their prices with practiced rhythm voices, rising and falling like a chant. You stop at a salt cellar stall, inspecting the grainy white crystals spread on a wooden tray. Salt is more than seasoning. It's a preservative, a way to keep fish edible for weeks. The seller, a wiry man with sharp eyes, weighs your interest as carefully as the salt itself. Prices shift subtly based on who's asking. Merchants might pay one rate, farmers another. You haggle quietly, knowing that overpaying here means less to spend elsewhere. Nearby, a fisherman from the coast displays baskets of dried sardines, their silvery scales catching the sun. You trade a small sack of rice for a handful, wrapping them tightly in cloth. They'll flavor soups for weeks, stretching your meager supplies through the leaner days. As you move between stalls, you catch snatches of gossip. A merchant's apprentice boasts about a shipment of silk coming in from Osaka. Two women whisper about a local official who suddenly left town. In a place like this, information flows as freely as coin, and sometimes it's just as valuable. But gossip can cut both ways. One careless story about your debts, your family, or your loyalties, and you might find yourself shunned or targeted by those who see advantage in your misfortune. You keep an eye out for the pickpockets, too. They're often young, small enough to slip through the crowd, unnoticed hands, quick enough to untie a coin pouch without a tug. Some work alone, others in pairs, one to distract, one to take. You've seen it happen, a loud argument, staged near a stall, while someone else quietly lifts goods from the distracted buyer's basket. The merchants themselves can be just as tricky. Scales can be weighted, measures shaved down, prices inflated for strangers. You remember hearing of markets in Kyoto where inspectors roam to enforce fair trade. But here, your own wits are your protection. It's not that everyone's dishonest, just that survival makes everyone sharper. Occasionally, a traveling peddler will appear selling items you've only heard of: Chinese porcelain, strange spices, paper lanterns painted with scenes from distant places. These goods are rare and expensive, meant more for wealthy townsfolk or the samurai households. Still, you linger to look, letting your eyes take in the colors and shapes, even if your hands never touch your coin pouch. Market day isn't just commerce, it's performance. You greet acquaintances with the right balance of friendliness and restraint, never prying too much, but showing enough interest to maintain ties. You watch how others interact, who's avoiding whom, who's standing a little too close to someone they shouldn't be speaking with. Before you leave, you visit the toolmaker's stall. Your hose handle has worn thin, and though you could fashion one yourself, his work will last longer. You trade part of your dried fish for a handle he's already smoothed and polished the wood warm in your hands. It's a small investment in the months ahead. With your purchases tucked away, you take one last glance at the bustle of the market. Stalls will close soon, the street emptying until the next appointed day. You step back onto the road toward the village, feeling the weight of your trades and of the small, silent calculations you've made all morning. By the time you return from the market, the first thin clouds of winter have begun to gather over the hills, their shadows creeping down into the valley. You know the signs the cold will settle in soon, and once it does, it will grip the land for months. The rhythm of your days changes with the season, not because there's less work, but because the work moves indoors and grows quieter, more deliberate. The rice paddies lie dormant now, their mirror-bright water long since drained, leaving cracked earth and the brittle stubble of harvested stalks. The air smells sharper, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from every chimney in the village. You spend mornings checking the food stores, making sure the sacks of rice are dry, the pickled vegetables sealed tight, and the dried fish hung high enough to be out of reach of both mice and curious children. Meals shrink as the season deepens. You stretch rice with barley or millet, add more broth to soups, make do with fewer vegetables. Every handful you take from the storehouse is weighed against the weeks still to come. You've seen what happens when a household runs out too soon. Quiet desperation, borrowing from neighbors, or in the worst cases, selling tools or clothing to buy food. It's not something you want to experience firsthand. Much of your time is spent mending robes with frayed hems, sandals worn through at the sole straw mats with broken weave. In the evenings, the family gathers around the eerie hearth, the central sunken fireplace that serves for both cooking and heating. The smoke curls upward into the rafters, darkening the beams over years into a deep, glossy black. The fire's glow is small, but the warmth is welcome, seeping into your sleeves as you work. The days grow short, the light fading well before you're ready to stop. Outside, snow begins to fall in thin, slanted lines, tracing the air before settling onto rooftops and tree branches. The sound of the village changes too. Less shouting in the streets, more muffled voices from behind sliding doors. Even the dogs seem quieter, curling up near warm corners rather than barking at passers-by. Cabin fever is real here. Weeks without much travel can make even the closest families irritable. You find yourself missing the bustle of the market, the heat of the bathhouse, even the wary glances exchanged with samurai on the road. Some villagers break the monotony with small gatherings, sharing tea, telling stories, playing simple board games like Go or Shogi. Others take to carving or weaving, turning idle hours into small acts of craft. The winter festivals offer brief relief. On New Year's, you hang pine and bamboo decorations outside your door, pound mochi with neighbors, and visit the shrine to pray for a good harvest in the coming year. It's a chance to step outside, breathe the crisp air, and feel the village moving as one, again, even if just for a day. But after the lanterns are taken down, and the last of the mochi is eaten, the long, slow season resumes. You rise in the dark, stoke the fire, and repeat the quiet chores that keep the cold at bay. In a way, the winter is a test, not of strength in the fields, but of patience, discipline, and the ability to make little things last. And then one morning, you notice the ice in the water bucket is thinner, the snow on the roof beginning to drip. A few green shoots push up in the sheltered corners of the yard. The thaw is coming. Soon the paddies will fill again. The tools will come out of storage, and the endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting will begin once more. You know it will be as hard as it ever was. But the truth is, you wouldn't last a day here without that cycle to hold you in place. The year in feudal Japan turns like a great wooden water wheel creaking through its endless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and enduring. You've walked the narrow roads, bowed to passing samurai soaked in the crowded bathhouse, kept watch through silent nights, and bartered under the noisy eaves of the market. You've felt the sting of winter air on your face and the ache of summer heat in your back. Every season has asked something of you: patience, resilience,